Welcome everyone. I have got a list of questions in front of me to do with the hips. So I am going to start with those. Feel free that the movers have submitted. So people that follow this account have submitted. So I'm not going rogue. And feel free also to type any questions in. It kind of goes up kind of quick, but I'll see if I can read it or bring it back down if it goes up too high. Okay, so I'm going to start with question. Any tips for someone whose hips seize up in the cold weather? Now this is quite a common challenge, I think. I think people often feel more stiff when they are cold. The best tip I can give for that is to keep moving, to keep the blood moving and keep the synovial fluid moving around the joints. So sitting for long periods of time in the cold weather, one of the worst things you can do for your joints, I think, because obviously if you're static, then body temperature declines, and so does the fluid around the joints. So we just got to keep moving, keep the lymph moving around the body as well. The lymphatic system doesn't have its own pumps, so we need to, in order to keep that circulating, we have to move. Otherwise it just kind of pools around the joints and that can make you feel a little bit stiff. Blood has its own pumps via arteries and veins, but the lymphatic system doesn't. So I suggest not sitting for longer than half an hour. Getting up, getting moving, even if it's just to get up to go and get a drink or something like that, that would be really, really helpful just to keep those hips moving. And of course, keeping the body as warm as possible. So getting a warm drink, warm food, making sure you've got enough clothes on, maybe you have a blanket over the legs while you're at your desk working or something like that, just to keep the hips warmer. I love doing that. It makes me feel quite senior, having blanket over my legs, but it does help. Okay, another question. My teacher says emotions are carried in the hips. Is that true, and what does it mean? I think it's as true as you want it to be. That's random, isn't it? A random statement. I believe they are. So I believe muscles hold emotion. And from what I've read and experienced, the psoas muscle, which is a big muscle group that helps hold the femur bone into the hip sockets, the thigh bone into the hip sockets, and helps functionally attach the spine onto the pelvis via the lumbosacral joint, is done so in part via the psoas muscle. So there's two main sections to the psoas, the iliacus and the psoas major, and it's thought that emotions, especially fear, are held within the psoas muscle. So when the hips are released, often we can release quite a lot of emotion, quite heavy emotions such as fear, sadness, etc. So it can be a good thing, releasing emotion by the hips. Hip openers can do this. I used to find cobbler's pose, Baddha Konasana, very releasing emotionally for the hips. Not so much anymore, but certainly when I was new to yoga, a lot of motion would come up via the hips when I did Baddha Konasana. So I think it's, some people will believe that is true. So if you just join, the question I'm answering is, are emotions carried in the hips? And from my experience, I would say yes. There is a wonderful book, well, a few wonderful books actually, by a teacher called Liz Koch, Koch, I think it's spelled, and she writes all about the psoas and release. So maybe have a look at her work. If you want to look into that more deeply, and I'm sure she's got social media accounts as well. So with regards to releasing emotion via the hips, it can be a really positive thing, but it can be an awful lot to integrate within the system if you're not used to doing it. So if you're fairly new to yoga, fairly new to me is kind of within the first 5 years of doing yoga, is just take it real easy on the hip openers, okay? Especially if you know you've got a lot of trapped emotions in there. So just take it real easy. Just do 2-3 hip openers tops in a yoga session and just build it up really gradually, because it can kind of leave you on a bit of a cliff edge otherwise. I heard that pigeon pose can damage the labrum. How can I make it safer? Okay, so let's explain first what the labrum is. Got a little pelvis here I made earlier. Welcome if you've just joined. The labrum is, so this is the femur bone, of course, pelvis here. These are the trochanters, so lesser trochanter, greater trochanter here, so a nice rounded bit. So that goes into the depression. This is called depression because it's going inwards, squashed. We all feel squashed sometimes, going into the socket there, which is called the depression. All right, so the labrum helps to hold the trochanters in place. Okay, so it's a lovely big ligament. So when you see an anatomy joint, it'll be quite pale in colour. That means it's a ligament, which means low blood supply. So we have to look after our ligaments because once injured, they're quite challenging to recover. So the labrum goes round the greater trochanter in particular and helps hold it into the hip socket safely. Now, with regards to pigeon pose, damaging the labrum, it's certainly got potential to do that. The reason being, with pigeon pose, we take the knee out to the side, so that's an external rotation, right? So that means the labrum's already getting a stretch. So as the knee drops out to the side, it'll take the thigh bone with it. And then you've got a bend in the knee, of course, and the foot comes, let's say it's the right leg, and then the right heel comes back towards the pubic symphysis joint. That's all well and good, as long as we don't overstretch it. So it's a great movement for the hip. It's brilliant for stretching the glute muscles and the piriformis in particular. So if you're quite prone to sciatica, pigeon pose can be really, really great to stretch around the sciatic nerve complex. However, it's when you start bringing the foot away from the pelvis. So sometimes I see this as an adjustment in pigeon pose. So the foot, the lower leg is instructed to come straight across the mat. This is actually really, really hardcore on the knee joint and the hip joint, in particular the labrum ligament. Most of our hips don't really like doing that, okay? And especially women, we've got different shaped hips, in that there's more variation for different types of female pelvis. Some like opening, some do not. So if you feel resistance in pigeon pose, my advice to you from the hips or the knee is ease off. You can do that by bringing the heel closer towards the pubic joints, and also placing block or bolster underneath the hip just to take pressure off the joints. That's what I do all the time now. I'm quite prone to knee and hip discomfort, so but I love the stretch in pigeon. So just take it a little easy. There's no rush with yoga. There is no end to yoga, so you know that, and it, you know, so you'll never get to the end anyway. So you might as well take your time and actually enjoy it because it's just ongoing. And also, what I found is with doing the deeper postures, you know, it doesn't necessarily take you up to the next level with regards to yoga, because you can get injured. You know, you can get frustrated, etc. So just my invite to you would just be to ease off a little, and if you're finding discomfort in pigeon pose, bring the heel in towards the pubic bones a little bit more. That will take pressure off the knee and the labrum, the hip socket, and also just pop some a bolster, cushion, pillow, block, whatever you need, whatever you've got, just underneath the pelvis, and that will support the joints a lot more. But you'll still get the stretch. Okay. Also, it's worth considering as well, if you're 40 plus, collagen for men and women, but particularly women, as we go into perimenopause, will start to decline. So that the collagen is our building blocks for all our tissues in our body, especially our connective tissue, and ligament is a connective tissue. So just take it easy because you're much more prone to injury 40 plus. Okay, moving on. Next question. Can everyone make it into middle and front splits? No, but what a wonderful word it would be if we could. I've been trying middle splits forever, not much progress. Okay, so middle splits, front splits. Okay, so I think that's referring to abduction, so taking the legs out to either side, and also bringing one leg forwards and back. So that would be extension and flexion of the hips. So it's, okay, so, you know, if you get drawn into the whole social media side of yoga, it's easy to think that being able to do splits is a really great level to get to with regards to your yoga asana, it's a little loud on, yoga asana practice. However, in my humble opinion, I think it's too much for the hips for most people. Some people are hypermobile and can easily go into the splits. Doesn't mean you should, however, because it is an awful lot on the joints, not just the hip socket, but also the pubic symphysis joint here. So you've got your pubic bones here, and then cartilage in the middle. So together that all makes up the pubic symphysis joint. Yes, pubic symphysis. And then you've got the sacroiliac joints at the back, okay? So where the ilium, the big wave-like bone, attaches onto the sacrum. When you're constantly doing splits, or even if you just do it 3 times a week in your yoga practice, it's a lot of strain on these joints. And as I've just mentioned, these joints are, any joints in the body are more susceptible to injury when we're over 40. Also, ligaments they join bone to bone, tendons join muscle to bone. Ligaments in particular, because they have a low blood supply, are more prone to injury than tendons and take a long time to recover, if at all. Sometimes they don't recover. I have a tear in my right hip from a hardcore yoga adjustment many moons ago. I just have to work with it. Okay, that's never going to fix completely. So I would, with regards to middle, splits, whichever way you're doing, in front of back or out to the side, I personally don't feel it's a particularly helpful movement for the pelvis to do. It's kind of fun. You get a bit of a buzz because it hurts. For most people it will. So that means you get a whole bunch of adrenaline, then oxytocin drop in. So it can kind of feel good to do it. However, for longevity of your joints, I don't think it's the best thing you could do, because I think it potentially, for some people, will destabilize the pelvis, especially later in life. So with regards to how can I make it safer, I'm not saying this to be flippant, but don't do it. There's that. You don't have to do it, to be a good yoga practitioner. As we know, yoga is much more than asana. It's the way you live your life. But if you do really, really want to do it, then I would place bolster underneath the pelvis, especially if you're going, if you're going front to back, so one leg forwards, one leg back, bolster across the mat, so the pelvis can sit. And if you're going out to either side, maybe a bolster long ways. But I do think there's better things you can do. You'll be better off with regards to keeping your joints healthy and strong and functional for the rest of your life doing strength work, as opposed to opening them in a really hardcore way, such as splits. Just my opinion. Can everyone make it in? I have hamstring pain from too much yoga. How can I adjust my practice? What's the end of that question? How do I know when I'm overstretching? Okay, great question. So hamstrings are a bit of a hot topic. Lots of people have challenges with their hamstrings. So sometimes genetically people just have shorter hamstrings. Like any muscle, you can have a muscle group that's tight and it can be genetic. Sometimes they can move into something called tendinopathy. Again, this is more prevalent in people over 40 because of the decline in collagen. When that happens, to just keep stretching them isn't going to help. You could potentially harm the muscle fibers and the connective tissue around it. So if there is a lot of discomfort in the hamstrings, when stretching them, I suggest, again, ease off. Keep a little flexion in the knee, so keep a little bend in the knee, and that will switch off the stretch reflex a little bit. The stretch reflex is something that starts to kick in when a muscle feels like it's being overstretched, and this is when the muscles start to shake. If your muscles are shaking, and I see this a lot in the hamstrings in people when they're pushing it too hard for their particular body, that means the muscle fibers are getting confused and they're getting irritated. This is a sign you need to ease off and take it a little bit more gently, okay? Otherwise, we can start to get tears, micro or maybe bigger tears in the muscle fibers of the hamstring, and that can be a long recovery, okay? So just to recap, if there's pain in the hamstrings, ease off the stretching. Do some strength work for the glutes, okay? So strengthen up those hip joints, then the hamstrings don't have to work so hard. That can also indirectly help relax the hamstrings. In standing forward bends, for example, again, keep the knees a little bent. One of the best stretches I feel you can do for hamstrings is lying on the back and simply taking a leg up towards the ceiling or sky and just pop the hands around the back of the leg. Keep the knee a little bent and just see where you go. That way you don't have a load of body weight going down through the hamstring, and it can take its time to unfold. And also, practice acceptance too. Some people just have short hamstrings and you have to work with that. Okay, so this leads on quite nicely to our next question. So I've been told I need to strengthen my glutes and hamstrings. So if you've just joined, I'm reading out questions that were submitted by the movers via the Facebook group. I've been told I need to strengthen my glutes and hamstrings. What could be good exercises for this? Okay, so I'm going to have to show you some because it's hard to explain it. So I've made sure I've cleared my space so it's nice and tidy. Okay, so there are many ways we can strengthen the glutes. But the main thing to remember is to strengthen the glutes. We'll start with glutes, then we'll go hamstrings. To strengthen the glutes, we need to go into hip extension. So the leg is going to need to go back in order for the muscle fibers to contract, okay? So any movement, there's loads of different movement styles on Movement for Modern Life. So we haven't just got yoga, which is great. So we've got Pilates, bar, qigong, loads of different stuff. So you'll find a lot of movement in there that helps to strengthen the hip joint as well as yoga. So if you want more opening of the hip joints, go more yoga. If you want more strengthening, I would say, of the glutes, experiment with some of the other classes on there, especially Pilates and bar. The reason being is because there's lots within those movement methods of taking the leg back, hip extension, to help engage the muscle fibers of the glute maximus, minimus and medius. So you've got 6 glute muscles, 3 sets of 2, so those ones I just mentioned. And anything really where the leg goes back, and I like to bend the knee as well to get the hamstring involved. So might do this on all fours, might just do this in a standing posture, might just do it playing around holding some dumbbells, will help to strengthen the glutes, because the muscle fibers of the glute muscle have to contract in order to create that hip extension, okay? With regards to strengthening the hamstrings, also, I'm just going back a little bit, also taking the leg out to the side, that's going to hit the glutes too in obviously a different way. So that's abduction, going back is extension, because we're hitting a different type of glute, so glute minimus and medius when we go out to the side. When we go back, again, we're hitting the glute medius, but also the glute maximus. So mix up your range of movements, yeah? Don't just think about opening and stretching the hips. Think about that strength work too, and doing any movements where the hip opens, i.e. hip extension. Balancing postures are really great for strengthening the hamstrings too. Any kind of resistance work really, so working with weights in the gym, working with resistance bands, again, working with your body weight where the muscle fibers are shortening a lot. So again, bar, Pilates is really good for that, and some styles of yoga, depends what you're going for. With regards to hamstrings, again, any standing balancing postures are really brilliant, because for the glute and the hamstring, actually, because those muscle groups are having to stabilise you while you're in a fixed position. Warrior 2, extended side angle pose, goddess pose, they're all brilliant ways also to strengthen hamstrings and glutes, because although the hip is opening to get into these movements, the muscles then switch roles once you're holding position, and they move into being fixators, which means they then lock you in place and again shorten. It's called they shorten a little bit to hold you in place, and then they move into a muscle contraction called isometric muscle contraction. So I suggest to strengthen glutes and hamstrings, mix it up. Don't just do one form of movement. It's hard. If you fall in love with the style, you want to do it all the time. But with regards to keeping the body nice and functional and injury-free, I would really mix it up. Okay, how important is squeezing the pelvic floor muscles during yoga? Well, I could do a whole workshop on that, but the quick answer is it depends really. I'm not sure if male or female submitted that question, because the answer is slightly different for both, but I'll just answer it in a general way if that's okay. So it's also known as Mulabandha, so lifting, engaging the pelvic floor during yoga is also called Mulabandha. When we think of it in terms of Mulabandha, we're thinking also about the energetics of lifting the pelvic floor as we move through yoga asana. With regards to energetics, it's about keeping the prana, our energy, in, rather than being a leaky bucket, as Mukunda Stars used to call it. So keeping that energy in and up towards our vital organs. I would say keeping the pelvic floor lifted and engaged is important in most yoga postures. It depends again what you're trying to achieve. If you know you need more strength in the pelvic floor, then of course it will be very important to keep it engaged and lifted during yoga postures, or again any form of movement. Some people, however, it's worth noting, their pelvic floor is actually too tight to be functional and actually needs releasing. So it's one of those. It depends, but I would say the vast majority of people do need to strengthen the pelvic floor more than it already is. Okay. But just so you know, there will be a smaller demographic that need to actually work on relaxing the pelvic floor. Yoga is brilliant for the pelvic floor in that you're in lots of static positions quite often. So once you've moved into positions, so let's say eagle pose, because I'm coming to a question on that next. Let's say eagle pose. Once you've got the legs crossed and then you come down into that squat position, the pelvic floor is stretching out a little bit, and then it's having to contract again in an isometric fashion to support the pelvis. So, and if that wasn't contracting, then we'd have less stabilisation through the pelvis. So it offers an awful lot of stabilisation for the pelvic bones. I'm just going to pull up my pelvis that has pelvic floor muscles attached to it, just to give you, I've got a whole range of pelvises down here. So just to give you a little bit more of a clue. It's kind of graphic. I'm just giving you a heads up. If you're eating your lunch, you might not want to look. This is a female pelvis, just so you know, but principles are pretty much the same. All right, so another pelvis here. I've got 4 pelvises. I'm kind of collecting them. So the pelvic floor is quite a big muscle group. It's bigger than a lot of people realise or think. Not surprising, because a lot of information out there is extremely confusing, and talk of the pelvic floor of the general public just tends to associate itself with continence. However, it's got a lot more function than that. So this model is, if you've just joined, seen a couple people just drop in, female pelvis clearly. So I'm just showing you this just to show you the 2 different layers of the pelvic floor, and also the bones it reaches out to, because that's important with regards to engaging it and how it works. Okay, so the underside. So we've got the pelvic floor reaching all the way to the pubic symphysis joint. It then goes out to the sitting bones, and then goes all the way back to the tailbone, and then underneath some as well. So you can see then, anywhere you move your legs or pelvis is going to affect the pelvic floor. Okay, so again, if you've just joined in, the question that was submitted is how important is squeezing the pelvic floor muscles during yoga. Now, it's actually important we don't squeeze them, because that can put a downward pressure through the whole abdominal and pelvic cavity, the 2 different cavities, and put pressure down onto the bladder, womb if you have one, and the bowel as well. So that's not always wanted. Generally in life, we want more of a lift, so we've got that support, because gravity is not kind to humans, and we need to work against it. Okay, we don't want to go with it. You'll be losing things. Now, there's 2 major layers to the pelvic floor. So you've got the superficial layer, which is close to the surface. So in anatomical terms, superficial, just lost a muscle, means close to the surface. And then we've got the pelvic diaphragm. Okay, so that's the deeper layer. So that gives support to some of the major organs. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that, just to show how far the pelvic muscles come out. You don't have to just do isolated pelvic floor work in order to work Mulabandha or the pelvic floor, depending on how you want to think about it. Any movement you do, even though if you're sitting, you could do some pelvic floor work, lifting pelvic floor. Try to move away from thinking of squeezing it, because that tends to encourage us to bear down and push down. It's a gentle lift, a subtle lift up. You might feel the belly button pulling too, so that means that Uddiyana bandha is engaged. So in other words, the transverse abdominis muscle is the deep core muscle, very, very deep, which meets up via fascia with the pelvic floor, is also engaged. So that's great, because that gives a lovely support to the whole core then, especially the lumbar region. Okay, so super important to keep that pelvic floor working. And then any yoga posture you do, again, come back to standing postures, eagle pose, warrior 2, working through sun salutes, lunges, any floor work, Paschimottanasana, Dandasana, etc. They can all you can bring in pelvic floor work to all of those. Just, it doesn't have to be strong. If you lift up Mulabandha and you can't breathe very well, then it's a little bit too much, again, in my opinion. There are specific Mulabandha practices, pranayama, where we do lift up and retain the breath, or actually expel the breath, then pause before, it's called kumbhaka, before we take the breath back in. However, that's really hard to sustain. What I invite you to do is, as you move through life and move through yoga postures, just think about drawing that pelvic floor up gently, and it's much easier to maintain. And then before you know, it will be habit, and you'll start noticing, a little bit more support for the bladder. If you have challenges with continence, possibly less incontinence challenges, more support for the lower back, etc. Getting on top of your breathing as well. So breathing well can really, really help with pelvic floor action. in that as you breathe out, if you breathe out in a nice, really focused way, not even just a few big sighs out a few times a day, can help to really work that diaphragm that sits under the lungs. And as the diaphragm comes up, the pelvic diaphragm, this is the deeper layer of the muscle fibers within the pelvis, also lift up. Okay, so they work together. Okay, so they lift together, exhale, and then they soften back down on the inhale. I invite you to try lifting the pelvic floor on the exhale, relaxing back down on the inhale. It's much more functional, and it's the way the pelvic floor wants to work, because it works in tune with the respiratory diaphragm as well. Okay, so another question here. How can I improve my leg position and eagle pose? It's so difficult to wrap my legs. P.S. I'm 64. Well, good on you for keeping your yoga practice going. And eagle pose is tricky for a lot of people. The older I get, the harder I find it to wrap the legs, for sure. My hips are not open as they were. However, they're stronger than they were, so, swings and roundabouts. With regards to eagle pose, the movement of the legs is called horizontal flexion, okay? So as the legs come across, of course, that's a horizontal movement, and then flexion is when a joint closes. So the hip joints are closing, and they're coming across the horizon, horizontal flexion. Now, that's not easy for everyone to do. Some of this, how you move into postures and move out of postures, depends on your build. You've got what you've got, right? So some people will have more bony compression in their hip joint, for example. So their labrum might fit super snug into that hip socket, and therefore, so it might be quite a big, sorry, I said labrum, I meant trochanter. So it might be quite a big trochanter. So when, therefore, they come across the body, there's actually not that much movement. And some people are a little smaller around here, and they can get more range of movement. Some people might have tighter ligaments and tendons than the next person. And again, that's something we can work with to a certain degree. But in my experience, it's good to not push that really hard, because you can start getting injuries, etc. So, it's a lot of this is just about honouring what you've got and working with it. So there's various reasons why, again, bringing your legs over into horizontal flexion, as in eagle pose, can be tricky. Might be some jamming up here as well. So often people are a little tight across the sacroiliac joints. Now, that's not necessarily bad. It's easy to think when you're into yoga being tight in the body is bad, but actually some tightness and stiffness can give you lots of stability. So again, it's that swings and roundabouts thing. Okay, so loads of ligaments across the sacroiliac area. They are there to support and hold the pelvis together, so be careful of overstretching them. There is a little tensile flexibility in there, so we can work with it a little bit, but we wouldn't want to push it too much. And it can also be to do with body type too. So if the thighs are strong and chunky, then of course wrapping the legs is going to be more tricky. The longer the legs are, the easier it's going to be to wrap. Shorter the legs are, the more difficult it potentially could be to wrap. So again, it can be to do with just the way you are, the way you're built, and then sometimes it can be due to levels of flexibility which can be worked upon. My advice there would just be, if it's really difficult to get the legs around, but you want to keep doing eagle pose, maybe reframe it a little bit. You find your pose within the pose, rather than the pose be put on top of you. You just take inspiration for the pose and find your shape. That's what I tend to do today. Again, it might come down to body type, in which case, other postures will come more easily to you. So, if the thighs are big and powerful, then postures such as, chair pose, warrior two, etc., you'll be able to hold those longer because you've got the power in the legs. So again, swings and roundabouts. But if you do want to wrap the legs and the foot's not coming around easily, what you can do is just use a block. So just bending the knees. One of my students actually thought of this. I hadn't thought of this before, so I need to just give her a shout out. So I'm just going to use the wall. I've got my hand on the wall because I find it very difficult to balance and do this. So bending the knees, and then you can just pop foot down onto the block, and then you don't have to worry about balancing as well as wrapping the legs, and we can just hang here, or maybe just take the arms back, and that way you still get the work through the legs, get quite a nice stretch across the SI joints, etc., without worrying too much with regards to whether the foot is behind the calf muscle. I don't know if the question is referring to taking the leg all the way back and the foot around the back of the calf muscle, but that's actually really hard on the knee joint anyway, so it's not something I would necessarily work towards trying to achieve. Just question here, I've gluteal tendinopathy and also bursitis. Both are on both sides. Any suggestions to me, please? Well, I'm sorry you've got that. I've had bursitis before and it's really painful. Okay, so, let's have a think. Okay, so I'll just explain what those things are. So tendinopathy is when it starts to get soreness into the tendon. So a tendon holds muscle onto the bone, ligaments hold bone. But I know I've said that already, but a few of you have just joined. And it's when the collagen can start to decline, or low collagen supplies, etc. in the diet. That's probably another talk. Can start to give more inflammation within the muscle fibers. And gluteal is obviously refers to the glute muscles. And then bursitis is, so the bursa is a little suspension pad that goes in between. You've got a few bursas through the body, but for the hip joint, which I think you're referring to, it's like a little suspension pad, a little sac of fluid that goes between the greater trochanter and the depression and the pelvis there. So there can be various reasons for this to happen. I experienced it when my hips were extremely mobile. I was doing a lot of the postures. The questions are about how do I do splits and pigeon pose, etc. I was doing an awful lot of those kind of postures, resulted in bursitis, and I believe the reason for that was I was losing stability through the pelvis, so I was getting a lot more pressure up into the hip socket. The person that's asked the question, I'm not sure why you've got it, but we can certainly have a little think on how to heal it. If you are doing, or anyone here, if you're experiencing bursitis or lots of hip pain and you've got a lot of hip openers in your yoga practice or movement practices, whatever they are, I invite you to rein those in big time. Take 50% of that range of movement. When you have bursitis, the muscles around the hip joint can start to stiffen up, so you kind of get tricked into thinking you need to stretch more, but it's not the case. The muscles are getting stiff because they're getting fed up of you stretching them out. So I feel like all muscles have a personality and they're like, just leave me alone. And the reason they're tightening up is to protect the joint, and that inflammation there. Inflammation is there as protection. So if we keep prodding that protection, then we start to get in more trouble. So if experiencing bursitis or tendinopathy, then I invite you to just ease off the movement, rein it in a bit, do some strength work. So I actually found swimming brilliant for not breaststroke though, front crawl. I don't think it's called that anymore, is it? It's freestyle. I found that brilliant for strengthening the hips up, and also got me back to enjoying movement again without it hurting, because you've got the support of the water. So it just takes the pressure off that joint. So it's a little respite from the discomfort, because as I'm sure you're aware, being in discomfort all the time is exhausting and quite depressing. So I found that very, very helpful. Also lots of Pilates, so lots of micro movements, working with short levers. Pilates, mat Pilates is perfect for that. So we've got a few different teachers on the movement platform now, so I suggest you check that out. Rein in, again, I've said about reining in your ranges of movement. So if you really enjoy doing full pigeon, for example, replace that with having blocks and bolsters underneath the hips, or one or the other, and then shifting the weight over onto one side. So if you've got the right leg forwards, sit onto the right hip with support underneath the pelvis as well, just so you still get that little bit of stretch, but you're not actually increasing your flexibility, because while the inflammation is there, your hip joints won't want that. Okay, what they want is some strength work. And then if you're doing working again with lots of long levers, so lots of the classic yoga postures where you're reaching the arms and legs, the appendages away from the torso in big ranges of movement, again, that puts an awful lot of pressure at the axis point. So let's say it's Padangusthasana, so where you're standing with, that's not the full name, but the name escapes me. So where we are standing, for example, reaching the leg out in front, pressing into the heel. I was in a stangi, so that just jumped into my head. And then bringing hands onto the hips. What is it? Oh, Hasta Padangusthasana, I think. Anyway, that's a classic posture to put an awful lot, or an example of how we can put an awful lot of pressure up into that hip socket. If you have bursitis, your hip would not like that. So that's an example of working with a really long lever. The hip joint is the axis point, right? So all that pressure is going into the hip socket. Now, if there's nothing wrong with the hips, then that's great. It's brilliant for building up strength. However, it's that kind of movement that can really upset the hip socket. So if you're working in that way, if you tend to work in a more strong way in yoga, again, I suggest ease off. Do it, but just bend the knees, the leg is at a right angle. That's a really quick way to halve the lever length. Other postures, really long levers. Again, just coming back to the more classic postures. So warrior 1, warrior 2, all the warriors actually, warrior 3, dancer's pose, etc. They're brilliant postures again in general, but if you have issues with the hips, they're not postures that are going to help you right now. So with bursitis, for example, because again, as soon as you're balancing on one leg and again working with those long levers, you've got an awful lot of pressure going up into that hip socket. So, and bear in mind as well, it can take quite a long time to heal from it. So I would just mentally prepare to have to ease off your practice for maybe a year or so. For me, I had bursitis on one side. It took about 1.5 years to heal. And again, I think it was from doing an awful lot of hip stretching, because I used to teach 20-something classes a week and I do a lot of demos. That would be my invite to you. And then also look at working with smaller levers, bringing in some different movement patterns, especially mat work, Pilates. I think that's can be very, very helpful. And maybe take a look at diet as well. If you've got a lot of inflammatory things within diet, then again, ease off. It can be pretty hard to drop away sugar, caffeine, all the really nice stuff straight away. So again, maybe halve it so your nervous system doesn't get too much of a shock. So look at, so I just wrote a blog for movement about back care, and I talked about foods that can help with inflammation in that. So check that out. That'll be on the blog page of movement. Any other questions? I think there was one I didn't answer. Oh yeah. So my hip is bad from a car crash. Sorry to hear that. Tight, poor range of movement. Can you suggest some movements, please? So whenever you experience blunt force trauma, which is what that would be, I do strongly suggest you see an osteopath. Chiropractors can be a little hardcore in my experience. Sorry if there's any chiros on here. So nice gentle osteopath, just to look, see what's going on, because it might be there's a little torsion, a little twist through one side of the pelvis. Depends what angle, the other car, if there was another car involved, came at you. So I suggest have a look at your mechanics, because there might be a little adjustment needed there. I've had a couple of car crashes, and the osteopath was brilliant for me. So just want to share that experience. And then with regards to being tight, poor range of movement, etc. I don't know what you're doing currently, but just try and bring in small amounts of movement and often. So I've always said, much better doing 10, 15 minutes a day than just one class a week, where you kind of shock the system into moving for an hour, and then you kind of spend the week recovering and then go again. Still better than doing nothing, don't get me wrong, still better than doing nothing, but little and often, much, much more effective if you have a joint that's prone to tightness and poor range of movement. Again, if I don't know how long ago this car crash was, but if you're slowly reintroducing yourself to movement, I would go for a movement pattern that has lots of short levers and repetition, again, such as Pilates, before you start doing the bigger movements in yoga. Having said that, whenever I've said in this talk about Pilates, forest yoga is also really, really good, because that has such short levers too, and it's nice and slow and really builds up core strength before moving on to longer levers. So Pilates and forest yoga, I think, are fantastic for injury recovery, and just fantastic anyway. Even walking is painful, just coming back to our bursitis person. Perimenopause will definitely affect levels of inflammation and collagen production. So hence the tendinopathy. Diet is key too, as my bloods show so much inflammation too. Okay, cool. Feel free to DM me and we can continue that conversation. I'm very happy to. No worries. Okay, so any other questions at the moment? Any other? I think I've answered all the questions. So I'm just going to summarise a little bit. So with regards to movements of the hips and just keeping them nice and healthy, if you are prone to inflammation have a look at what you're taking in. So are you taking in nutritionally, I mean, so are you taking in lots of fluid, not wine, water, just to flush the system through, maybe a little lemon juice in there or something, and cutting down on sugar, caffeine. I'm a fine one, I've got a coffee right there, so I'm a little hypocrite, but I have 2 coffees a day. It's caffeine as well, obviously inflammatory. Lots of processed food, again inflammatory. You're all yogis, so you'll know this. So just check that out. You still need some fun, right? So it's been shown time and time again that working to the 80-20 rule helps people stick with exercise and eating well much better than being good whatever that is 100% of the time. Okay, so weekends kick back a little bit, for example. Monday to Friday, watch what you eat, watch how you move, etc. Yeah, no worries, Didi. So have a look at what you're taking in, inflammatory wise. Also, move little and often. So if you're working from home, which lots of us do now, I do loads, remind yourself to get up every 30 minutes. If you're working at a desk, make sure you get up every 30 minutes. I tend to sit on a ball quite a lot. So I've got a big fitness ball. My osteopath has said to me, because my SI joints were getting a bit jammed up, to not do it for longer than 30 minutes at a time now. So you can alternate between chair and ball. And the balls are great because you don't then, you can't, it's very hard to slouch with them because you'll fall off. And also you've got little micro movements happening all the time as well to keep the blood flowing through the joints. If you are going to use a ball or even chair, actually, just make sure the hips are slightly higher than the knees. That will help to avoid locking up of the hip joints. Make sure you do a big variety of movements too. So lots of rotation of the hips, so that's actually called circumduction, lots of abduction, flexion, so that's horizontal flexion coming forwards, extension going back. Do a little impact exercise too. That can just be walking, doesn't have to be running. So it can be walking. As if you are currently having an episode of inflammation, if you can swim, swimming is brilliant. And even if you can't swim, just walking up and down in the pool can be great, and great for mental health too, because you can't look at a screen. That's one of the reasons I love swimming. I get a break from screens. So I actually found that when I had bursitis, walking up and down, because some days it was so bad, even swimming was too much. 15 minutes of time was actually very, very helpful. Practice patience as well. If you're currently injured and having challenges with your body, practicing patience, not always easy. Give yourself a little break here and there, from the discomfort. Any kind of relaxation, yoga, nidra, etc. can help to take inflammation down and also just give you a little respite from the discomfort. If you are currently injured or you experience tendinopathy on a regular basis, for example, just again work with shorter levers and put less weight down through the joints as well. So forest yoga, Pilates, again, brilliant for that. Pelvic floor muscles are super important for helping to support the joints. So again, even if your challenge is in the socket, so bursitis or a tear in the labrum or tendinopathy around the glute, strengthening the pelvic floor is going to be helpful because the pelvic floor is big. It attaches to the whole underside of the pelvis. So if the pelvic floor is nice and strong, it's going to take pressure off the joints. So you've got to try and get that even strength going through the pelvic, the whole pelvic area, for the health of the pelvis. And if there's postures you're trying to attain in your practice and it's just not happening for you, maybe that's just meant to be. That's not a cop out, but honestly, when I forced myself into postures, that's when I get problems. And same with various clients that I've had come to me injured from trying to do certain styles of yoga and movements and stuff, or just doing things. I think it's good to realise not every single posture is for you. That is part of the practice. Okay, so I hope that was helpful today. I hope that was helpful and you enjoyed me nattering on. But yeah, we'll chuck this up on the grid. My Instagram is Sally Parks Women's Yoga. Please don't follow Sally Parks Yoga. I don't have control of that account anymore. It's currently controlled by some extremely enthusiastic hackers, so don't go to that one. Please come to my ladies one. My women's one, but anyone can follow, of course. It's just got a women's theme, so women's wellbeing theme. So Sally Parks Women's Yoga. Pleasure, Esmeralda. Pleasure's all mine. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. And any questions, feel free to DM me over on my Insta.